Part 1. The Sandbag Omen, Hour 0 to 6. The air on Hill 303 tasted like pulverized stone and premonition. Sergeant Elias Vance, known ironically as Preacher for his grim atheism, drove the men of Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon, with a fury usually reserved for contact. Intelligence, delivered by a sweat-soaked colonel at dusk, was terse. A major NVA regiment, the infamous Shadow Division, was moving through the Ia Drang Valley network, expected to hit their forward position within 48 hours. Not might hit, but will hit. Vance immediately recognized the hill as a sacrificial lamb, a crucial listening post and potential delaying action designed to draw fire while the main American forces repositioned miles away. The next 6 hours were a blur of frenetic, desperate engineering. Every shovel scrape, every heavy thud of a sandbag dropped into place was a countdown marker. The heat was a tangible entity, thick and suffocating, turning the red dirt into a clinging paste that filled every pore and cranny of their uniforms. Vance didn't just supervise. He dug until his hands blistered and bled, ignoring the sting, knowing that the quality of the earthworks was the only thing standing between them and oblivion. He meticulously directed the placement of machine gun emplacements, ensuring overlapping fields of fire that covered the choked jungle slopes. Specialist 4th Class Thompson, usually the platoon joker, worked in silent terror, his eyes wide and fixed on the tree line. Vance watched him, assessing the breaking points. Thompson's fear was contagious, a virus spreading through the exhaustion. Vance leaned down, his voice a rasp against the rhythmic crunch of dirt. "Thompson, look at this dirt. This dirt is going to save your life. Not God, not the lieutenant, just the 4 feet of solid earth you put between yourself and the barrel of an AK." It wasn't encouragement, it was brutal, practical theology. By midnight, they had carved a formidable, jagged scar into the summit, but the silence pressing in from the surrounding jungle felt heavier than the weight of their own meager defenses. Vance checked the radio one last time. Static hiss, punctuated by the metallic click of the handset. 42 hours left, and the first wave of physical exhaustion was already giving way to the deeper, more corrosive acid of dread. Part 2. The silent perimeter, hours 6 to 18. Night fell not as a relief, but as a deeper envelope of dread. The moon was obscured by thick cloud cover, leaving Hill 303 swallowed by absolute, impenetrable blackness. Vance had enforced sound discipline ruthlessly. Coughing, rattling gear, even loud breathing was forbidden. The lack of light enhanced the auditory senses to a crippling degree. Every insect drone became a helicopter. Every rustle of dry leaves sounded like a company of men flanking the position. The worst sound, however, was the absence of sound, the deep, unsettling vacuum that suggested the enemy was already too close to make noise. Vance positioned himself near Rookie, a 19-year-old FNG, fucking new guy, named Miller, whose breathing had become shallow, punctuated by wet gasps. Miller gripped his M16 so tightly his knuckles were white, radiating raw, uncut terror. Vance could smell the fierce sweat, sharp, metallic, and undeniable. At 0300, a trip flare was momentarily half-lit by a sudden, violent crack of lightning kilometers away. The fleeting illumination revealed nothing but jungle, yet it sent a jolt through the line. Miller shifted, knocking his canteen against the earth. The sound was deafening. Vance crawled quickly toward him, pressing a hand firmly, silently, over the plastic canteen. He stayed there for 5 minutes, inches from the rookie's face, communicating only through the pressure of his palm. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper of pure venom, too low for anyone else to hear. "You make that noise again, Miller, and I will personally put you out of your misery before the VC gets the chance. We live and die by silence." The threat, raw and immediate, was effective. Miller's panic subsided, replaced by a cold, operational fear of Vance. This was the duality of the weight. The enemy was not the darkness outside the wire. The enemy was the collapse of discipline and the internal chaos of the man next to you. Vance knew the NV excelled at patience. They weren't rushing the line. They were listening for a failure in discipline, waiting for the exhaustion to create an opening. The longest, most agonizing 12 hours of the waiting game were those defined by zero action, zero sound, and the crippling realization that they were the exposed nerve ending of the entire defensive operation. Part 3, the heat wave and the ghost signal, hours 18 to 28, day 1 dawned as a furnace. The Central Highlands sun, amplified by the reflecting red dirt, turned the trenches into slow cookers. The temperature soared past 110 degrees, and the air was so thick with humidity it felt like swimming through molasses. The men's already depleted reserves were aggressively drained by the heat. Thirst became the dominant reality, overriding fear. Lieutenant Hayes, barely 23 and dangerously green, tried to maintain radio silence, but the heat-mandated checks on water supplies, which were rapidly dwindling due to the unexpected labor of the previous night. At 1,400 hours, the tactical radio operator, a pale, nervous kid named Perez, signaled Vance with 3 tight clicks of his fingers. Perez handed the handset over, his face etched with confusion. The transmission was heavily garbled, overlaid with static that sounded almost deliberate, like someone was manipulating the receiver miles away. Vance listened closely. He could make out fragmented words: bypass, south flank, regiment confirmed. Then the signal vanished entirely. Did the Shadow Division shift its route? Were they flanking Hill 303, leaving the Americans to defend an empty hilltop while the main force rolled past? This new uncertainty was worse than the expectation of attack. Vance made a snap decision that defied protocol. He needed eyes on the lower ridge. He selected Sergeant Cruz, a scout with a reputation for impossible stealth, and himself. They spent the next 2 hours crawling through the suffocating underbrush 300 meters beyond the wire, the heat pounding their exposed helmets. Every step was calculated, a battle against thorns, fire ants, and the dizzying effects of dehydration. They found clear signs of movement, freshly broken bamboo shoots, and, chillingly, the faint, sweet smell of burned charcoal, suggesting a meal cooked recently and quickly. But no enemy troops. They returned, utterly spent, their uniforms plastered to their skin, carrying only confirmation. The enemy was there, close enough to smell, but deliberately choosing not to engage the hill. The waiting had shifted from defensive preparation to being used as a tactical distraction. Vance realized they weren't holding the line. They were marking the target for the NVA to avoid. The strategic purpose of their agony was slowly becoming clear, and it was humiliating. Part 4, digging the hole deeper, hours 28 to 36. The second night brought psychological erosion. The men hadn't slept properly in 40 hours. Not restful sleep, just fitful, jumpy intervals punctuated by adrenaline spikes and the necessity of watch rotation. The physical necessity of perpetual vigilance began to fray the edges of sanity. To combat the paralyzing fear and exhaustion, Vance ordered them to reinforce the trenches, pushing them back into physical labor. "You dig, you don't think," he barked. The men were now digging not for defense, but for distraction, throwing dirt mechanically, sweat mixing with the grit in their eyes. Specialist Thompson, who had been on edge since they arrived, started laughing, a high, unnatural sound that immediately drew Vance's attention. Thompson wasn't laughing at anything. He was simply laughing, the sound tapering off into a shuddering sob. When Vance approached, Thompson pointed vaguely at the tree-line. "They're watching us, Sarge. I see the flares, the little sparks. They're smoking cigarettes and waiting for us to lose it." Vance scanned the dark perimeter. There were no cigarette sparks, only the shimmering optical distortion of extreme fatigue. He knew Thompson was near collapse. Instead of reprimanding him, Vance put a shovel in his hand. "They want you staring at the jungle, Thompson. They want you hallucinating. You dig your head straight. You make this hole deeper than their patience." The incident highlighted the cruel tactic of the Shadow Division. They weren't just delaying the attack. They were conducting a protracted psychological siege. They were investing in American exhaustion. The lack of direct, Combat forced the soldiers to turn inward, battling their own minds, their own bodies. The constant expectation of annihilation, divorced from the catharsis of actual fighting, was warping their perception of reality. They were defending a line not against bullets, but against the insidious, creeping doubt that maybe the battle had already begun, and they were the only ones who hadn't realized they were losing. Part 5. The Smell of Jasmine and Fear. Hours 36 to 44. As day 2 faded into its second long night, the enemy finally showed its hand. Not through bullets, but through sensory manipulation. The wind shifted, bringing with it a sickly sweet, unmistakable aroma that cut through the metallic tang of sweat and cordite. Jasmine. The NVA often used specific jungle perfumes or scents deliberately left behind to mess with the enemy's sense of security. The smell was associated with home, with peacetime, making the jungle feel actively hostile and unnatural. Coupled with the scent, the platoon began hearing subtle, rhythmic sounds far down the slope. A faint, almost inaudible percussion, like someone tapping a drum or rock with precision. It was too distant to be threatening, but too consistent to be natural. It sounded like a work rhythm, or perhaps a slow, measured march. The combined sensory inputs had a profound effect on the exhausted troops. It suggested that the NVA was relaxed dash, perhaps even bored, while setting up for the kill. Sergeant Vance understood the sophisticated cruelty of this psychological operation. A sudden, violent attack releases adrenaline and focuses the mind. This sustained, low-level harassment kept the men perpetually on the knife edge of readiness without ever allowing the release of action. It was a torture of proximity and uncertainty. Vance spent the night moving silently from foxhole to foxhole, speaking rarely, mostly just kneeling beside the men, forcing them to look him in the eye. He didn't offer comfort. He offered shared vigilance. He saw the shift in Rookie Miller. Miller was no longer shaking. His fear had calcified into grim determination, his eyes scanning the jungle with cold, focused malice. He was combat ready, but without a combat opportunity. That readiness was burning fuel uselessly. Vance knew they had passed the point of peak readiness. They were now descending into critical operational fatigue, and the slightest genuine provocation could cause a chain reaction of confusion and overkill. The silence was tightening its noose. Part 6. The Monsoon Tease, hours 44 to 46. Just 4 hours shy of the expected climax, the jungle unleashed a fury entirely its own. A black wall of monsoon clouds slammed into Hill 303, preceded by a ferocious wind that bent the trees nearly horizontal. Then came the rain. It was not mere precipitation. It was a vertical river hitting the foxholes with the force of pressure washers. Within minutes, the trenches, which had been painstakingly dug for protection, became narrow, mud-filled canals. Water poured in faster than the men could bail, dissolving the soft red earth and threatening to collapse the sandbag parapets. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous, deafening roar that swallowed radio communications and the ability to hear anything outside the immediate trench. The men immediately snapped back to peak adrenaline. The NVA were notorious for attacking during heavy downpours, using the noise and chaos as cover. Every soldier gripped his weapon, eyes straining through the obscuring sheet of water, expecting the silhouettes to materialize out of the driving rain. Lieutenant Hayes screamed uselessly into the wind, trying to coordinate the submerged defenses. Vance ignored the LT, focusing instead on the wire. He knew if they were coming, they would be using the flooding to neutralize the trip flares and mines. The next hour was pure, elemental combat against nature and expectation. They bailed, they reinforced, they shouted challenges into the storm, their senses screaming that the battle was finally upon them. But the firing never came. The only movement was the water, the mud, and the wind. Then, as abruptly as it began, the monsoon squall moved on, leaving behind a landscape saturated, dripping, and eerily quiet. The profound adrenaline crash that followed was devastating. The men were soaked to the bone, shivering violently despite the remaining heat, and utterly, totally spent. The ultimate false alarm. The enemy had successfully used the weather, or perhaps merely allowed the weather, to exhaust the Americans further without expending a single bullet. Part 7. The clock strikes 0 hours 48 to 50. The 48-hour deadline arrived precisely at 0600, marked by the sickly orange glow of a damp sunrise fighting through the valley mist. The silence that accompanied the deadline was heavy, palpable, and absolute. There was no attack, no bugles, no whistles, no human movement on the perimeter. The Shadow Division, the formidable regiment they had been told to expect, was simply not there, or at least not engaging. The initial reaction among the men was not relief, but a deep, nauseating confusion. They had prepared for 2 days to die. The absence of the killer left them feeling strategically irrelevant and metaphysically lost. The waiting, which should have concluded, instead entered a new, terrifying phase of indefinite paralysis. Vance reported to Hayes, his voice flat. "Perimeter clear, Lieutenant. No signs of contact." Hayes, leaning against the radio shack, rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "Command is silent, Sarge. We held the line. We waited them out." But Vance knew better. They hadn't waited them out. They had merely been bypassed or ignored. The failure of the anticipated combat was a failure of intelligence, or worse, a successful deception by the enemy. The agony of the hold had officially concluded, yet the danger felt multiplied. An attack they expected was terrifying. An attack they didn't expect, coming from an unknown direction at an unknown strength, was paralyzing. The soldiers, previously united by a shared countdown to certain death, now eyed each other with suspicion and fatigue. Thompson began scraping mud off his boots with painstaking, repetitive movements, a nervous tick of post-climax energy release. The exhaustion of waiting had replaced the exhaustion of fighting. The line had been held perfectly, the objective achieved, but the victory tasted like ash and betrayal. They were still on the hill, and now they were utterly alone, strategically obsolete, and waiting for the second shoe to drop. Part 8. The aftermath of nothing, hours 50 to 54. With the deadline passed, the atmosphere on Hill 303 became morbidly anticlimactic. The immediate tactical need for absolute silence and readiness was lifted, but no one dared move or stand down completely. Vance ordered limited rations, not because they needed to save food, but because the men needed activity. As they ate the tasteless rations, Vance finally allowed himself to process the reality. The entire deployment was a costly, brutal feint. The intelligence had been entirely accurate about the NVA movement and timeline, but not about their target. The NVA had successfully used the knowledge of their own movements to draw U.S. attention and critical air cover assets to this solitary, heavily defended hill. While Bravo Company sat stewing in their own fear, the Shadow Division had likely slipped past the south flank, exploiting the very silence they had enforced. Vance felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a rage that eclipsed his 2 days of fear. They hadn't defeated the NVA with courage or firepower. They had simply been a highly visible marker on the map, a piece of strategic bait. The only casualty was their own collective sanity and 2 days of irreplaceable military readiness. Vance climbed out of the trench, ignoring the protests of Lieutenant Hayes, and walked the perimeter wire. He examined the trip flares, the claymores, the intricate fields of fire he had set up. They were perfect, a flawless defense against an assault that never materialized. The perfection of the defense felt like the greatest failure of all. He looked down at the distant jungle, realizing the enemy had won the battle for time and position without firing a single round into his perimeter. They didn't need to fire. The mere threat was weaponized silence, proving more effective than fragmentation grenades. The agony of the hold was the core objective of the enemy, and they had executed their mission flawlessly. Part 9. The relief and the empty battlefield. Hours 54 to 60. Around midday, hours after the original expected contact window had closed, The unmistakable chop of Huey rotors announced the arrival of the relief column. Alpha Company, moving slow and cautious, began to crest the hill. The contrast between the two groups was jarring. The men of Alpha Company were dusty, tired from the march, but operationally sharp. The men of Bravo Company, by contrast, looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, gaunt, their movements slow and jerky, covered in a patina of dried red mud and profound psychological fatigue. They hadn't fought, yet they looked more destroyed than men who had survived a week-long siege. Alpha Company's sergeant major, a man named Riggs, found Vance surveying the trenches. Riggs shook his head, looking around the empty, heavily fortified hill. "We heard the intelligence. Massive contact expected. You boys see anything? Hear anything?" Vance stared past him, watching Miller mechanically cleaning his M16 for the 10th time. "We saw everything, Sergeant Major, and we heard everything." That was the problem. The transfer of command was swift and anticlimactic. As the men began gathering their gear, the physical process of leaving Hill 303 felt like shedding a skin of concentrated fear. Vance deliberately avoided looking back at the defensive works. They were monuments to a non-battle. Trenches dug not for bullets, but for the burial of hope and sleep. Descending the hill, the jungle felt different, less threatening, but infinitely more cunning. The quiet valley below seemed to mock their frantic vigil. They learned then, unofficially, from the fresh troops. Intelligence reports confirmed the Shadow Division had hit a major South Vietnamese supplied depot 80 kilometers south, timed perfectly with the American fixation on Hill 303. Bravo Company had been so successful in its mission to appear strong that it had become strategically nullified. They had perfectly held an empty line. Part 10. The Echoes of Silence, the Permanent Scar. Leaving Hill 303 was not an end, but a continuation of the strain. Back at base camp, amidst the comparative safety of the company perimeter, the men of Bravo Company struggled to reintegrate. They had no physical wounds, yet they carried a weight far heavier than shrapnel. They had endured 48 hours of intense combat readiness without the release of actual combat. The result was a pervasive, crippling paranoia. Rookie Miller, now silent and strangely rigid, flinched violently at sudden, mundane noises, the slam of a truck door, the clatter of mess hall trays. Thompson developed a debilitating insomnia, unable to reconcile the silence of the waiting with the chaos he knew existed just beyond the wire. Vance watched them, recognizing the shared, silent scar. He tried to explain the strategic reality to Lieutenant Hayes. The NBA didn't fire Lieutenant because they didn't have to. They weaponized time. They weaponized the intelligence we were given. They made us fight ourselves for 48 hours. Hayes didn't fully grasp it. He saw the mission as a success because the hill hadn't been overrun. But Vance knew the true cost. The battle wasn't won by holding the line. It was lost the moment they were ordered to wait. The enemy had fired the silence, and the echo of that silence was what truly destroyed them. It was a trauma without visible genesis, a story of absolute defense against an invisible enemy who had executed the perfect psychological operation. Elias Vance knew that for the rest of his tour, and likely the rest of his life, the most terrifying sound wouldn't be the explosion of an incoming mortar, but the absolute, crushing silence of the jungle, pregnant with anticipation, waiting to be filled with the sound of the attack that never came.